This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thanks for joining this week's NC Spin. While you're wrapping up your Christmas shopping, NC Spin is wrapping up this week's big issues. We start our show with a consultant's report saying our state needs to spend significantly more money on K-12 education. We ask why more teachers are failing licensure exams, and we talk about the tug of war that goes on between the legislative and executive branches of our states and the court's role in those battles. And we put a bow on our package by asking the panel to tell us something we don't know. Speaking of the panel, this week they include former Governor Bev Perdue, John Hood, syndicated columnist and author, Howard Lee, former state senator and former chair of the State Board of Education, and Anna Bevan Gravely, the executive director of NC Free. We begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages from our underwriters.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
Well, before we get started, let's invite your input. Each year, we ask our panel to nominate the person who we will name as the NC Spin Tar Heel of the Year, a person who's made the most significant contribution to our state. Well, this year we want your help in selecting that person. The only criteria for nominations is that the person lives in or now or was originally from our state and has done something really noteworthy this year. And since this year also is going to close out a decade, we're going to name the NC Spin Tar Heel of the Decade. So you can nominate someone for that also. To submit your nominations, go to our website, ncspin.com, click on the Contact button, and send us your nominations. We'll announce our selections on our December 27th show. Now, let's get started. In 1994, 5 rural school districts sued the state, saying they didn't have the funds they needed to provide their students with the same level of education that wealthier counties had. The Leandro case, as it became known, reinforced the constitutional mandate that all children receive a sound basic education, and the Supreme Court turned it over to Judge Howdy Manning to interpret what that meant and how it should be enforced. Well, we've been trying to figure it out ever since that time. So a consulting group was engaged to study North Carolina public education school spending, and they released their report this week. Their summary conclusion is that North Carolina needs to increase its $8.3 billion a year budget on K-12 education by an additional $800 million a year. I want to ask each of our panelists. We want to talk about specific recommendations from the report, but I want to know, what is your reaction to the Leandro report? Bev?
I thought the report was same old, same old. It was a lot like the 1994 report. And the bottom line is you can't just put $800 million in a pot and divide it by 100 and give it to all 100 counties equally. If you're going to focus on providing every child in the state with a sound basic education, as our Constitution provides, then you have to go where the problems are. Go to low income, high crime levels, low disparity, where all the problems have been for 30 years and still remain, and enrich those teachers, give them teacher salary increases, and help the kids there learn to read and write, do basic math, and they'll come up in the world and they'll have a sound basic education.
Have a better chance. Anna Bevan, what's your reaction to the report?
My first reaction is, where is this money coming from? It's a very large number, and I don't know where it's going to come from.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were asking that. Howard Lee, you were chair of the State Board of Education for a number of years, very involved in education even today. What's your reaction?
Well, I tend to agree with the governor. I think Bev has really signaled that it's not a question of just money that we need to make available in support of these schools in order to have success. There are other things we need to do, and I didn't feel that any of that came out of this report. They just talked about the money and they talked about qualified teachers. If we're going to use money to keep doing the same thing we've been doing, we're going to continue to have the same failures we've already experienced. So I was not all that impressed with what we've got, although I think the value of the report tended to reinforce what we already know. Now the question is, do we have the courage, the commitment to go do what we have to do?
That is really interesting, because that is the question. One of the final questions I've got is, do we have the courage to make these changes? John Hood, your evaluation.
Well, this is a vast, sprawling report with indices that also number in the hundreds of pages.
300 pages were in the report.
Well, there's way more than that. That's just the report. The appendices add even more. The supplemental reports are the basic reports from which this was taken. What I would say about that is, because it is large and massive and has lots of data points in it, you can find almost anybody who's interested in education policy will find something in the report they agree with, something that is in fact essentially a consensus. They will find other things. I found many things that I thought were highly debatable or just flat out incorrect. But I think the real problem is that there was a profound and unwise decision about this. This report was available in the summer, and it was not shared with the general public. It was shared with a few people. We went all the way to December. It created a lot of, I think, mostly warranted expectations that there was a bit of a trick happening here, that this is intended to create a consent order for a judge, ultimately the judicial system, to order the legislature to do things that the legislature does not have to listen to the courts about, the constitutional power of appropriating funds. So I think there's a separation of powers constitutional crisis around the horizon. I wish there hadn't been. It would be much better if they just treated this report as interesting, as advisory.
I understood this was finished and concluded in July. Why did they wait till December? Were they waiting for the legislature to get out? What was going on?
Basically because it is unfortunately essentially a partisan document. I wish it hadn't been, and parts of it really don't read that way, but it's part of a partisan plan. I wish it hadn't been, because it would have been more seriously accepted if it had not been.
ABJ, John makes a great point. Democrats said, we told you so. You need to be spending more money on public education.
Right.
Republicans said, wait a minute. You're talking about a big tax increase here. Is any of this discussion helpful to improving education, or is this just more partisan political bickering in our state?
I don't think that this is helpful for the discussion to move forward and talk about what's actually going to improve schools and student performance. Honestly, it felt like this report was like striking a match just to watch it burn, because we're dealing with the same kind of rhetoric that we've been dealing with before. I mean, everyone wants kids to learn. Everyone wants competent, smart teachers in the classroom. Everybody wants good principals in schools. And this is just the same thing.
Well, let me just tell you, if you want them, you've got to pay for them. I am not going to go to Bertie County and be a principal if you don't pay me for going to Bertie County, because my social life might be in Wake County. And if I'm a 22-year-old college graduate, I'm not going to any of those far eastern counties or far western counties without some kind of decent pay.
And this is roughly where the largest problems
where the problems are.
Howard, do you agree?
Hold on. What do you mean that that's where the largest problems are?
The largest problems are in inner city urban school districts,
right,
and in poor rural areas.
That's right. It isn't just a rural
but
urban
it's both.
thing.
And you go
and the
where
original,
the
Leandro, as you know, the original case was from rural districts saying we are underfunded. The
and
urban
the bigger
district
counties,
that they intervened and said, no, we're underfunded. The report is interesting because it really does delve into the question of how much does it cost. And there are lots of things in there that people on both sides aren't going to want to read that actually is true.
Yeah. And Howard, one of the stories or articles that I read said this is a 10% increase if it's adopted. It's a 10% increase in public school funding, and it is going to necessitate a tax increase in North Carolina. Will it? Well, we had an $800 million budget surplus last year.
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily has to result in a tax increase. It could, and if it does, that's fine. But I'm not as concerned about the amount of money we're spending as to the plan we have for utilizing that money to achieve the outcomes we say we want to have. For example, there's no question in my mind that the key person to succeed or help our schools succeed is the principal. And we're not spending money to help develop principals and then giving them the flexibility within the school to make decisions and to carry out a plan.
And that was one of the recommendations
I was
about
going
it.
to say, in fairness to West Ed, the consultant group, they've been around, they've been doing this for decades. Basically, states or localities, plaintiffs that want to justify tax increases go to West Ed and they do a report. But in fairness to them, they also talked a lot about things like giving principals more authority, giving school districts more authority over their spending, strengthening the principal pipeline. They did talk about that, but it got washed away with the focus on the amount of
We've
money.
known that.
We've been talking about that
We-
for 100
That's
years.
Yeah, but
exactly
one of the
right.
things that they talked about, we've also talked about a lot, and that is that we need to change the basic funding formula
That's
for
exactly the
education in
problem.
North Carolina.
Yeah. You got it.
And we dance around this subject almost like the school governance. So what's it going to take to do something about that? And by the way, what is the right way to fund public schools?
Well, we not only need to change the funding formula, we need to change the authority distribution. I still think there's too much authority centered at the central level and not enough at the schoolhouse level, because given principals flexibility and support and an engagement in their communities, they can certainly make a difference in terms of the quality of teachers and maintaining those teachers in the classroom.
But Anna Bevan, this all comes down to a matter of trust. And essentially what we've said through the years is because we've seen some abuses, we just don't trust principals. We don't trust teachers to make the right decisions. Is that anywhere close to being justified? You wrinkled your nose, but essentially that's
No, I agree.
That's exactly what we're saying here.
Yeah, I fear that the financial part of the report that came from West Ed is really overshadowing. And as we've discussed, there are a lot more things that are going on here than just the amount of money that's going into this project or going into revitalizing schools. I mean, we've been trying to do this for a really, really long time, and I think that the money figure really changed the whole conversation.
Dinosaurs were still roaming the earth when we started some of these conversations. The one thing I hope we can find some consensus about is that they really dwelled on the early childhood education, pre-K, Smart Start, as being fundamental to all of this. And Bev, I know this is something that you have, you were speaking to us before we got started today about initiatives so far as helping kids learn to read.
It's fundamental to who you become as an adult. I mean, it's going to be the trigger for your life success. Yeah, it begins at 3 or 4. I believe it begins at birth. You've got to have a system in place in a state, and I'm not talking about socialism. I'm not talking about taking over the family, the home, but you have to have public and private options available for children who might otherwise go unserved. Smart Start works. North Carolina Pre-K works. The private daycares and schools across the state works. So we've just got to have more of them and be sure every kid in the state has some kind of preschool experience. My grandson is in kindergarten, and he was talking to me about his little friend who was in and out of trouble already. And he said, "Mimi, it's okay because he didn't go to preschool. He'll get better." Now that's a shame when a kid says that.
Well, so part of all of this, John, involves fully funding pre-K. We've talked about that for a long time. What's it going to take for the legislature to just say, okay, we're going to make sure every 4-year-old can go to a pre-K?
Well, they have been adding funds to it, but interestingly, that proposal in the West Ed report is not a very large component. Mm-hmm. Most of the component is elsewhere. It's not on the pre-K
I did see
side.
that. Yeah, I wondered about that. Why?
Because, well, I will be diplomatic and say that is not what the interest groups behind the plaintiffs want. That's not the industry that receives that funds is different from the industry that would receive these funds. But just to put it bluntly, I think that this may lead to a fight, a gigantic lawsuit that goes to the Supreme Court, all sorts of stuff, and it didn't need to. It could have been a real collaborative process. They made a conscious decision not to be collaborative and to leave the legislature completely out of it. It was a mistake.
I hear that, and yet we've had these reports, we've had these discussions, nothing's happening. or I take that back. Not nothing is happening, but not significant changes, Howard. Is this the type of thing? I hear what John's saying, and I don't know that I disagree about the impact of it. But is that what it's going to take to make some changes here?
You know, I'm not sure what it will take to make changes here. I just have watched us through the years develop plans and put those plans on the shelf. We know exactly what to do. We've got the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Center. We've had studies done by the universities. We have all the answers we need in order to put a good preschool, pre-K program in place. We've passed Smart Start. We've passed More at 4. And all of these things offer the strong support of being able to have success at this level, and we just won't carry it out. And I think that unless and until we step up to do that.
Is that lack of willpower on the legislature's part? Is it because of the fact that the educators themselves are standing in the way of some of these reforms, or is it politicians?
I think we're too splintered. I think it's politicians, and I think it's the educators in some cases, and I think it's private citizens who really don't understand. I think there's a twofold approach we have to take. One is preschool, early childhood education, but I don't like people who keep saying to me, if kids hadn't performed at grade level at a certain age, there's no hope for those kids to perform at grade level.
I was getting ready to say, if I went over and punched a Howard Lee button and a Bev Perdue button, they'd say, if you don't get that kid reading at grade level by the third grade, you got bad consequences.
Third grade. I would hope that somebody would watch this program and take heed that the answers are there. They've been suggested. I'm repeating what Howard said for 20 years. We just need to do something. Look at the money that exists. I'm not saying I don't like lawsuits. I hope that that's not the rationale behind the report. I'm surprised to hear it. I hadn't heard that discussion before. I think that the groups trying to massage their own special interests should be told to step out and shut up. I think that legislators...
Sit down and let some adults take over.
I'm serious. Yeah. The legislators should get into this.
Well, I want to couple this discussion about Leandro with the evidence that we've seen recently that more and more teachers are failing the licensure test they must pass. Until 3 years ago, a starting teacher had to pass a test dealing with their specific content area as well as teaching theory. But in 2016, our legislature gave starting teachers 3 years to pass that test. And the results are pretty disturbing. We've gone from having a 96% passing rate to an 80% rate. Howard, we got to ask, why has this passing rate declined so much in such a short period of time? Are our schools not doing a good job preparing teachers? Has the test material changed? Is the caliber of the people entering the profession? What's your take on this?
I don't really actually have an answer for that, but I have to tell in the spirit of complete disclosure, I'm not a strong supporter of teacher testing. I don't think the tests show any indication as to who's going to make a good teacher or a bad teacher. But I know that's part of the reality and we have it. I think it falls back on the schools of education. I really believe that there's no school of education who should graduate a teacher and not have that teacher prepared to pass whatever instrument is out there.
Well, should they have to, Anna Bevan, should they have to take the test upon graduation before entering? I mean, they seem to think that this 3-year delay period that they're putting off taking the test, and maybe they've forgotten some of the teaching
I definitely would put it off. I would definitely put off taking the test if we're being really honest. Because everybody knows when you get into a job, that job becomes all-consuming, and you focus on doing that job well. And so tests are the last thing on your mind. I think that's a very real scenario.
John, we say repeatedly, we want a well-qualified, well-prepared teacher in every classroom in North Carolina. How are the students impacted when they've got a teacher who can't pass the licensure test?
That's an interesting question that Howard was getting at. It's an empirical question. Can we in fact prove that teachers that pass, for example, teachers that teach middle school or high school English, literature, history, that if they can't pass the math test, then their effectiveness is questionable, which I just don't think there's good evidence for. Now, there is some evidence
Wait a minute,
about
there's not good evidence that
that scoring a certain point on a test correlates with the teacher effectiveness,
being a master
particularly when we're talking about a particular subject that people are teaching. Now, if you've got a chemistry teacher or a physics teacher or a calculus teacher who can't pass the math test, that's a serious problem. I will be less concerned if we're talking about a first or second grade teacher not being able to pass the high-level math test. So I am concerned that we are focusing on the wrong thing if we're trying to increase the quality of teaching. I don't think this particular instrument does what people think it does.
Yeah, Bev, you do a lot of work with teachers in your foundation. What does this data say to you? What does this speak to you about?
Well, the data from the country, I mean, this is a national, Praxis is a national test. And so the data from the country is that we are not the only state. States across America have lowered the passage rate for their teachers. And talking to teachers, we understand that their content is not specific. It's what's John's point. If I'm going to teach third grade math, do I need to know about physics and chemistry? The content I'm taught as a math teacher doesn't parallel the questions on the test. And so I think the schools have got to do a better job of teaching teachers what the test says, if you believe in tests.
All right. I want to change subjects. Our Constitution calls for 3 separate branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial. While many maintain they should be equal, our governing document tilted the balance of power to the legislative branch. Nevertheless, there's always been sort of a tug of war over the separation of powers between the two. These arguments have often been exacerbated by a legislature controlled by one party and executive branch by the other, and have increasingly been brought into the judicial branch to sort out the separations of powers. I want to discuss some of the current examples of these battles, but I want to first get to sort of an overarching. Bev, you've got a unique perspective in that you served in the legislature for many, many years, and at the same time, you were governor. So you saw these tugs of war going on back and forth. Are they worse now than they were years ago when you first entered politics?
I think the issues are worse now, Tom. The issues are more significant in terms of the people of the state. When I was sued, it was over money, over pots of money. Who could spend the money, me or the General Assembly, or in the legislature, the governor or the legislature? And so those questions are always going to be there. Who has the power and the control? But what about the substantive issues? Who can control voting rights in North Carolina? Who can control what kind of bathroom I go to? Who can control redistricting? And all of those issues become more pronounced. They affect every single person in the state. And overall, they affect the reputation of North Carolina.
Maybe this is maybe a simplistic analogy, but it occurs to me that the legislature is supposed to provide the money to buy the trains and build the tracks, so to speak. And then the governor is supposed to make sure the trains run and run on time. Is that a pretty good analogy?
I think that's pretty spot on.
Is that a pretty close separation of powers issue?
I think so. I think that and Governor Perdue mentioned this earlier, it's about money. There's always going to be conflict about money.
Well, so let's look at a couple of recent issues on this, because and unfortunately my time is running out, but I want to get to some of it. Let's go to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline question, because you've had a lot to say about this, John. Did DEQ have the authority to decide to approve the environmental application of the pipeline? And if so, did the governor have the right and authority as executive branch, because DEQ falls under his administration? Did he have the right and authority to be involved in those discussions?
Of course. Well, everybody ultimately answers to the governor. The executive branch is the one who permits a pipeline. The separation of powers dispute is about the fund that was set up.
I got that.
That's where things went awry.
All the way down to that point, the governor was acting within his authority. Would you agree with that?
He was acting within his constitutional authority, even if
to the
sometimes
point
it was
of
unwise.
setting aside that fund.
No, I don't believe that's an executive
Negotiating
function.
that fund. You don't think he...
If there is a statute that authorizes the executive branch to do so, then that's fine. But there was no statute authorizing any such behavior.
So the real issue with this was his, first of all, negotiating it and then determining how the money was going to be spent. Y'all agree with that?
Yeah, historically, though, the governor's had control over that pot of money.
Yeah.
The money that comes in as a
Well,
result
the
of a
Court of
settlement.
Appeals decision just recently said that when block grants are given to the state, that the governor and the executive branch doesn't have the authority to designate how it's going to be spent. This seems to want to go back to the days when the legislature appointed the governor. I mean, why do we even need a governor if the legislature is going to make all the decisions?
Well, I think that's a good question, and certainly one that I think continues to plague us.
Yeah.
You don't have any of the control, according to the decision, it'll go to the Supreme Court. You don't have any control over what about the education money coming from the federal government? What about the money coming for health and human services?
Well, like the Volkswagen settlement.
Everything, everything.
Yeah.
Well,
all the pots.
Settlements and federal funds are different kinds of things. And remember, the mitigation fund was not a settlement. There was no settlement. There was no lawsuit.
Anna Beavon, are we just going to keep having these separation of powers discussions
For
forever?
sure.
Forever and ever?
I don't see it stopping. I mean, it's been going on for a really long time, and as long as it's centered around money, it's going to continue to be a thing.
Yeah, you keep coming back to
I
that
do.
theme.
I really.
This
That's
is
been
your
my theme
today.
for the day. Yeah.
Money is the root of all evil.
It talks. It does.
Money talks and nobody walks. So far as it goes, we're going to have to leave it there. But it's a discussion we're going to have to take up again. You've heard our discussion on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter. Be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch us on Facebook. And join us next week when we have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.